Imagine, right, just imagine walking into a room filled with the absolute most powerful politicians, um, judges, and religious leaders in your entire country.
Yeah, the real heavy hitters.
Exactly. And the King of England is sitting right there. And instead of bowing or instead of taking off your hat like you're supposed to, you just look him directly in the eye, use his first name, and tell him he has absolutely zero spiritual authority over you.
Which, I mean, in the mid-1600s, doing that wasn't just considered a little rude. It was essentially a death wish.
Right. People were tortured, mutilated, and executed for far less than that.
Oh, absolutely. But for this rapidly growing group of radical thinkers in England, looking authority in the eye and just completely refusing to play along with the social hierarchy wasn't some PR stunt. It was just Tuesday.
It was just Tuesday. I love that. Welcome to the show, everyone. We are doing a custom deep dive right into your personal research notes today, specifically focusing on this really fascinating document you sent over titled Quaker.pdf.
It is a brilliant set of notes.
It really is. And looking at the psychological profile attached to these notes, I am incredibly excited to get into this because the notes are framed around this persona, this specific profile named Liz.
Yeah, the Liz profile.
Right. And the energy described here is just fantastic. It describes an independent thinker, someone who constantly challenges norms, someone with a, dominant, unconventional personality who absolutely refuses to follow rules simply because those rules happen to exist.
And that specific psychological profile maps so perfectly onto the historical movement we are exploring today. I mean, the people who started this movement were the ultimate disruptors of their era.
Totally. And if you are listening to this right now, if you are someone who naturally questions the rules, someone who looks at the established way of doing things and just asks, but why?
Yeah.
Someone who really seeks authentic understanding over just, blind obedience to institutional authority, then this deep dive is right up your alley.
You are definitely going to resonate deeply with the people in these notes.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's unpack this. The overarching mission of our analysis today is to explore the contemplative ethical tradition of Quakerism.
Right, officially known as the Religious Society of Friends.
Yeah, the Religious Society of Friends. And we really need to understand how this radical kind of ragtag group of people from 17th century England managed to bypass literally all traditional religious hierarchy.
They just threw it all out. The priests, the pulpits, the stained glass, the dogma, all of it.
Right, choosing instead to rely entirely on direct, unmediated personal insight. And we are going to examine how that massive internal psychological shift triggered some of the most profound outward social changes in modern history.
From the abolition of slavery to global peace movements, it is a wild trajectory.
It really is. But if we are talking about challenging norms and refusing to follow arbitrary rules, we have to start by looking at the specific world these early Quakers were born into, right?
Yes, you absolutely cannot understand the radical nature of this movement without understanding the sheer chaos of mid-17th century England.
Because this was not like some peaceful contemplative time. The country was basically tearing itself apart.
Oh, completely. We are looking at the 1640s and 1650s. So this is the period during and immediately following the English Civil War. It is a time of absolute, just political and spiritual trauma.
Right.
You have a nation that has literally executed its own king, Charles I. The monarchy is temporarily abolished. Oliver Cromwell takes over, and basically the entire infrastructure of society is just up for grabs.
And at the very center of all this turmoil is the church.
Exactly.
The church.
Because the established churches at that point, they weren't just places you went on Sunday if you felt like it. They were the state.
Yeah, they were the government, the tax collectors, and the thought police all rolled into one massive institution.
Wow.
The Church of England was an immensely wealthy, deeply hierarchical institution that enforced its power through the law. Every single citizen was legally required to attend services.
Which is wild to think about today.
Right. And more importantly, every citizen, regardless of how incredibly poor they were, was legally required to pay tithes.
Okay, tithes. Break that down for us.
So a tithe is a mandatory tax of roughly 10% of their agricultural produce or their income. And this went directly to support the local priest and the grand architecture of the church.
So wait, if you're like a starving peasant farmer, you're struggling to feed your own children, the local magistrate is literally knocking on your door demanding a tenth of your wheat.
Yep, a tenth of your wheat, your wool, whatever you produced, to pay the salary of a wealthy priest who lives in a massive stone estate right down the road.
That is just, that is infuriating.
It was deeply oppressive. And that same priest is the only person legally authorized to interpret the Bible or tell you what God actually wants. The political power flowed entirely top down.
So God spoke to the king or the archbishop, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that authority trickled down through bishops and priests until it finally reached the common person sitting in the pew.
And the common person was just, what, a passive recipient?
Completely passive. They had zero agency. They were experiencing what historians call a profound spiritual famine.
A spiritual famine.
Yeah, they looked at these grand cathedrals, the really ornate rituals, the Latin liturgy that they couldn't even understand, and the paid clergy, and they just felt a complete void. It felt like a massive institutional racket designed to extract wealth and enforce compliance.
Completely divorced from actual spirituality.
Exactly.
So into this massive void steps a young man named George Fox. Your notes highlight Fox, who lived from 1624 to 1691, as the central catalyst for this whole movement.
He is the spark, definitely.
And what's wild is he's not a lord. He's not some Oxford-educated theologian. He's literally a shoemaker's apprentice from Leicestershire.
Right, a completely ordinary working-class guy.
And he goes through this intense period of spiritual depression, right? Like he wanders around the country for years, talking to every priest, every scholar, every radical preacher he can possibly find, just looking for answers to his profound despair.
And they all give him terrible, just completely empty advice.
Yeah, I read this part. One priest literally tells him to smoke tobacco and sing psalms.
Yeah, just smoke it off.
Another suggests bloodletting to cure his depression.
Right, because obviously, draining your blood will fix your spiritual crisis.
It's so absurd. But he realizes through all this that the entire professional class of clergy is completely bankrupt of any real spiritual insight.
They have the degrees, they have the fancy titles, but they don't have the truth.
Exactly. And then in 1647, Fox has this radical breakthrough. He records in his journal that he heard a voice saying, "There is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition."
And the realization he had in that moment was world-shattering. He realized he didn't need a priest. He didn't need an intermediary. The divine was already present inside him.
And this becomes the absolute core theology of Quakerism, right? What they call the inner light.
Yes, the inner light.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they call it the seed of Christ within, or just simply the Spirit.
It's the belief that God speaks directly to every single human being. No intermediaries, no gatekeepers, no theological degrees required.
And it is so important to pause here and really recognize the political explosiveness of this theology.
Yeah, let's dig into that.
Because in the 17th century, the idea of the inner light wasn't just some pleasant, affirming, self-help spiritual concept. It was a sledgehammer taken to the very foundation of society.
Because of the equality aspect.
Exactly. Think about it. If a poor, illiterate farmer or young female servant has the exact same direct access to divine truth as the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Then the archbishop is completely obsolete.
Precisely. The entire hierarchy of the church, and by extension the state itself, is rendered completely unnecessary.
It's a total dismantling of the power structure. I was thinking about this, and think about this in modern terms. It is the exact equivalent of inventing open source software in a world where one massive, ruthless corporation owns all the computers.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Right, because before the Quakers, spirituality was highly proprietary. The source code of divine truth was locked behind a paywall of tithes.
A literal paywall.
Yeah, you had to use the paid clergy, you had to accept their rigid, closed-force doctrines, you had to participate in their formal sacraments, you basically had to use their approved user interface.
And if we follow that open source analogy, George Fox and the early Quakers were essentially distributing the source code for free.
Yes.
They were saying the inner light is pre-installed in the hardware of every single human being at birth.
That is so powerful. And this movement wasn't just Fox, obviously. He found incredibly capable co-founders who helped build the operating system for this new way of life.
Right. People like Margaret Fell.
Yes, Margaret Fell. Your notes call her the mother of Quakerism.
She was incredible. She turned her massive estate, Swarthmore Hall, into the literal nerve center and logistical hub of the entire movement.
Which is huge, having that kind of safe harbor.
It was vital. And she wrote brilliant theological defenses of the inner light. She was actually one of the first people in modern history to publish a comprehensive theological argument for women's right to preach.
Because mathematically, if the inner light is in everyone, it's obviously in women too.
Exactly. Which, again, in the 1600s, was a terrifying thought to the male-dominated establishment.
Absolutely terrifying to them. You also have William Penn in the mix, right? An aristocratic convert who later used his massive wealth and his royal connections to found Pennsylvania.
Yeah, as a holy experiment, a safe haven for religious freedom.
And then there's James Naylor, this highly charismatic former soldier. His intense street preaching drew massive crowds, though your notes mention he later became a very controversial figure within the early movement.
He did, yeah. But together, these figures were organizing a mass exodus from institutional religion. And the established authorities, they recognized the threat immediately.
Because it hits them in the wallet.
Exactly. If people stopped believing they needed the church, they would stop paying those tithes. And if they stopped paying tithes, the entire economic and political structure of local government would collapse.
So the authorities pushed back, but they actually pushed back with a pretty critical logical argument, didn't they?
They did. They looked at the Quakers and basically said, look, if everyone is just listening to their own internal voice and everyone claims God is telling them what to do, you are going to get a holy society. You're going to get absolute chaos. You're going to get anarchy.
Which, I mean, is a completely fair point.
It really is.
Because human nature being what it is, if I say, my inner light tells me to steal your horse, and you say your inner light tells you to bring down my barn, we have a massive problem.
A huge problem.
So how did they avoid instantly devolving into total societal breakdown back in the 1600s?
Well, they avoided chaos by understanding that the inner light, while deeply personal, could not be validated in isolation. The individual revelation had to be tested against the collective discernment of the community.
Okay, so it needs a system of checks and balances.
Exactly. They needed a container, a highly disciplined mechanism to differentiate between genuine divine guidance and, simple human ego or mental illness or just bad indigestion.
Right, like did God tell me to do this or did I just eat some bad mutton?
Precisely. And that container is what we call the meeting for worship.
The meeting for worship, this is the architecture of silence.
Yeah.
Because if you are used to literally any traditional Christian church service, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, evangelical, whatever, walking into a traditional Quaker meeting is going to feel like you've landed on another planet.
Completely alien. Let's deconstruct the physical space first, because the architecture literally reflects the theology. A Quaker meeting house is deliberately plain. You will not find ornate stained glass, towering steeples, golden crosses, or statues anywhere.
You won't even find a pulpit at the front of the room.
Right, because a pulpit implies a hierarchy.
It implies that one person stands above the rest to deliver the truth downwards.
Exactly. So instead, the seating is usually arranged in a square or a circle, with everyone simply facing each other on plain wooden benches. It is an architecture designed specifically to avoid outward distraction and to forcefully enforce human equality.
So you walk into this plain room, you sit down on a wooden bench, and then nothing happens.
Nothing happens.
There is no liturgy. There is no scheduled hymn to sing. There is no pastor standing up to welcome you. There is no sermon. The entire room just descends into complete unmediated silence.
And it can stay that way for an entire hour.
Which is, I have to push back on this, just thinking about the sheer logistics of human attention spans.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
Sitting in silence with 50 other people for an hour sounds agonizing. If no one is leading the service, if there's no program, doesn't it just feel like an empty, wasted hour where everyone is just secretly making grocery lists in their heads?
It certainly can feel that way to a beginner. And actually, early Quakers wrote extensively about the severe psychological discipline required to center down.
To center down?
Yeah. The silence is a crucible. It's often deeply misunderstood by outsiders who look at a silent Quaker meeting and confuse it with modern secular mindfulness.
Right, like a wellness app.
Exactly. We live in an era of corporate wellness retreats, where you close your eyes and focus on your breathing to lower your cortisol levels and improve your productivity.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a solitary, inward-facing exercise.
It's all about me.
Right. Quaker silence is entirely different. It is an active, communal listening. It is an incredibly tense, expectant waiting. When you sit in that quiet, you are initially bombarded by your own racing thoughts, the grocery lists, the anxieties, the surface-level noise.
Right.
But the discipline is to acknowledge that noise and slowly let it sink to the bottom, clearing the internal waters so that the much quieter, deeper voice of the inner light can actually be heard.
It's an equalizer, because think about a standard corporate meeting or a traditional church service. The space is almost always dominated by the loudest personality, right? Or the most charismatic speaker, or the person with the highest title.
Always.
The silence completely neutralizes all of that. You cannot rely on your social status when nobody is talking.
No, you can't.
But the silence isn't an absolute rule. It can be broken, right? Through something your notes call vocal ministry.
Yes, silence is the baseline, but anyone, literally anyone in the room, regardless of their age, gender, or level of education, can stand up and speak.
Anyone at all.
Anyone. However, the internal criteria for breaking that silence are fiercely stringent. You do not stand up to share an interesting thought you had on the drive over.
Right, it's not open mic night.
Exactly. You do not stand up to debate politics or to give a pre-planned lecture or to argue with the person who spoke before you.
You only speak if you feel spiritually compelled. Your notes actually describe a physical sensation that early friends experienced, which is actually where the derogatory nickname Quaker came from, right?
Yes, they would literally tremble or quake under the intense pressure of feeling a message from the spirit that they were trying to hold back.
That is intense.
It is. The internal vetting process for vocal ministry is really fascinating. A Quaker sitting in silence might feel an idea rising up, but before standing, they're supposed to test it.
How do they test it?
They ask themselves a series of questions. Is this message true? Is this message just for me, or is it meant for the whole community? And most importantly, is this coming from the divine, or is it just my own ego wanting to sound smart?
Wow. That takes a lot of self-awareness.
It does. Only if the pressure to speak becomes completely overwhelming, only if withholding the message feels like actual disobedience, do they finally stand up and break the silence.
And when they finish, they sit down, and the community just absorbs the message back into the silence. There's no applause. There's no back and forth debate.
Done.
It's a completely different paradigm of gathering truth. Because we are so used to the idea that truth is something handed down to us by an expert with like a PowerPoint presentation. We go to a seminar or a church to get a takeaway.
Right, a neat little summary.
But this process isn't about being taught top down. It's about being transformed from the inside out. By stripping away all the outward sacraments, the baptism, the communion bread, the planned music, they force themselves to find the sacred right there in the immediate, uncomfortable present moment.
And this practice of intense inward listening builds an incredibly strong, unyielding moral compass. Because they aren't distracted by getting the rituals right, they become hyper-focused on whether their lives actually reflect the truth they are hearing in the silence.
So the meeting house isn't a place to hide from the world?
No, it is a training ground for how to act when you walk back out the door.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual daily lifestyle of these independent thinkers. Let's look at the core values outlined in your research, which are famously summarized by the acronym SPICES.
Yes, SPICES.
I love a good acronym. It stands for simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship.
That's right.
Now, honestly, these sound like lovely, harmless corporate core values you'd see on a motivational poster in an HR department today.
They do sound very gentle to modern ears. But in the 17th century, these were incredibly dangerous, weaponized principles. They weren't abstract aspirations. They were rigorous, non-negotiable, daily disciplines that put early Quakers on a direct collision course with the legal and social establishment.
Let's look at how equality and integrity specifically manifested in their daily lives, because it caused absolute outrage.
Oh, massive outrage.
Because if you genuinely believe that the inner light exists in every single person equally, then the entire social hierarchy is a lie.
And the Quakers absolutely refused to participate in the lie. They started with language, actually.
Language, like vocabulary.
Yes, they adopted what was called plain speech, which meant they went around saying thee and thou to everyone they met.
Okay, to a modern listener, saying thee and thou just sounds like you were quoting Shakespeare or trying to sound overly formal and kind of religious.
Right. But to understand why this was so explosive, we really have to look at the linguistics and the social grammar of the 1600s. The English language at that time had distinct formal and informal pronouns, much like vous and tu in modern French, or usted and tu in Spanish.
Yeah.
You was the formal plural pronoun. It was used to address nobility, magistrates, superiors, and strangers. Thee and thou were the informal singular pronouns. You only used them when speaking to your intimate family members, young children, or your social inferiors like servants or peasants.
So the grammar itself was a tool for enforcing class boundaries.
Precisely. If a peasant walked up to a wealthy landowner or a judge and called him thou, it was not a quaint, old-fashioned greeting. It was a massive, deliberate insult. It
Wow.
was a linguistic leveling, as the peasant saying, I do not recognize your superiority. We are on the exact same level.
So when Quakers started using thee and thou universally to kings and paupers alike, it was viewed as highly offensive, deeply aggressive social rebellion.
Extremely aggressive.
I just love this concept. Think about this in a modern context. It is the exact equivalent of walking into a massive formal corporate board meeting, refusing to use someone's hard-earned title like doctor or your honor, and just casually calling the billionaire CEO by their first name, dude, while refusing to shake their hand or stand up when they enter the room.
It is exactly like that. It is a total, unapologetic refusal to play the social hierarchy game.
And they didn't stop at pronouns. They also had the issue of hat honor.
Yes, the hats. In 17th century society, men wore their hats indoors. The rule was that you only removed your hat in the presence of someone of a higher social rank.
Right.
You took your hat off for the magistrate, the priest, the lord, and the king. You also took it off in church to show deference to God.
And the Quakers just completely rejected this.
Completely. They reasoned that if all people are equal before God, no human deserves the deference of hat removal. They would walk into courtrooms, into churches, into the presence of the king himself, and leave their broad-brimmed hats firmly planted on their heads.
And the authorities absolutely lost their minds over this. Your notes show that Quakers were repeatedly beaten, fined, and imprisoned simply for refusing to take their hats off.
Because the magistrates saw it as a total breakdown of the social order. They thought, if they won't respect my hat, they won't respect my laws.
But to the Quakers, taking the hat off would have been a failure of integrity. It would have been acting out a lie.
Exactly. And that rigid commitment to integrity led to an even more dangerous practice: the absolute refusal to swear oaths.
Right, swearing oaths.
This was based on a literal interpretation of the biblical command from the book of James to let your yes be yes and your no be no. But it was deeply philosophical too.
How so?
They argued that if you have to place your hand on a Bible and swear an oath to tell the truth in a courtroom, it implies a double standard of truth. It implies that when you aren't under oath, you are free to lie.
Oh, that's clever.
Quakers insisted on a single, unbending standard of truth at all times. Their word had to be their bond.
Wait, hold on, though. Not swearing an oath sounds like a minor bureaucratic hurdle. Why was this such a massive legal trap for them?
Because of the oath of allegiance and the oath of supremacy. In the turbulent political climate of England, where Catholic plots to overthrow the Protestant monarchy were a constant paranoia, the government demanded that citizens swear an oath of loyalty to the king.
Okay, I see where this is going.
When Quakers were brought into court, often on totally trumped-up charges of disturbing the peace or holding illegal worship meetings, the judges knew exactly how to trap them. They would simply demand that the Quakers swear the oath of allegiance.
Knowing full well that the Quakers' internal integrity would forbid them from swearing any oath, even if they were perfectly loyal citizens who had zero intention of overthrowing the government.
Exactly. The judges weaponized their integrity against them. And when the Quaker refused to swear, the judge would invoke a brutal legal statute called praemunire.
Praemunire, what did that do?
This allowed the state to confiscate literally all of the Quakers' property, strip them of the protection of the law, and sentence them to life imprisonment.
Over an oath.
Over an oath.
Oath.
Thousands of early Quakers languished and died in horrific, disease-ridden 17th century dungeons places so filthy they were effectively death sentences, simply because their internal moral compass would not allow them to swear an oath or tip a hat.
That is an incredible, almost terrifying level of commitment to the bit. I mean, they were willing to lose their homes, their wealth, and their lives over pronouns and hats.
Yes, they were.
But, okay, refusing to tip a hat or swear an oath in court is one thing. Those are interpersonal social norms. The real question is, how did these internal values of equality and peace scale up?
That's the big question.
Like, how did they hold up when these people stepped out of the meeting house and faced the massive, violent, systemic evils of global history?
And that is exactly where the Quaker story shifts from being this quirky, heavily persecuted historical sect to becoming a major, disproportionate force in global social reform. This brings us to their guiding behavioral principle. Let your life speak.
Let your life speak. This is where the inward contemplation explodes into outward conviction.
Precisely.
Because they didn't just sit quietly in their plain rooms trying to be morally pure, you know? They became pioneers in some of the most critical, massive social reforms in human history. Your notes highlight their massive roles in the abolition of slavery, in prison reform, which makes a lot of sense given how much time they spent in prison, in women's rights, and in global peace movements.
Yes. And to understand why they were so active, we really have to look at the theological shift they made. The vast majority of Christian history is obsessed with doctrinal precision.
Right, getting the beliefs exactly right.
Exactly. Churches split, wars are fought, and people are literally burned at the stake over debates about the exact nature of the Trinity, or the mechanics of communion, or the specific wording of the Nicene Creed.
And the Quakers.
The Quakers completely bypass that. They generally avoid fixed written creeds altogether. They're not interested in making you sign a statement of theological faith.
Because what you say you believe is irrelevant if your life doesn't actually demonstrate it.
That's exactly it. The math of the inner light is inescapable.
If you sincerely believe that a piece of the divine, the seed of Christ, exists in every single human being, then you literally cannot enslave another human.
No, you can't.
You cannot buy and sell them as property. You cannot wage war against them and blow them up. You cannot lock them in inhumane, torturous prison conditions. To do so would be to do literal violence to God.
Yes. Their massive social activism wasn't some secular side project. It was the unavoidable mathematical output of their core theology.
And we see the profound impact of this logic in their fight against slavery, don't we?
We really do. The Quaker approach to abolition is a masterclass in how rigid personal integrity can slowly shift an entire society. We have to look at the figure of John Woolman in the mid-1700s in the American colonies.
Woolman is such a fascinating case study in your notes, because he wasn't a fiery politician giving massive speeches to thousands of people, right? He was a humble tailor.
Just a tailor, but he recognized the evil of slavery deeply, and he realized that even the Quaker community in America was complicit, because many wealthy Quakers owned enslaved people or profited from the slave trade at that time.
So what did he do?
Woolman's method of activism was entirely rooted in the Quaker process of quiet, relentless persuasion and personal consistency. He completely refused to use any product of slave labor. He wore undyed clothing because indigo dye was produced by enslaved people.
Wow, that is commitment.
And he traveled up and down the East Coast, mostly on foot, visiting wealthy Quaker slave owners. But he didn't burst into their homes screaming at them or demanding instant political change.
Because that would just make them defensive.
Exactly. He used the contemplative method. He would sit in their parlors, often in deep silence, and gently, persistently ask them questions about the inner light.
Like Socratic questioning, but spiritual.
Yes. He would ask how they reconcile their belief in the divine equality of all souls with the practice of holding humans in bondage. And if he stayed at a home that used enslaved labor, he would quietly insist on paying the enslaved individuals directly for the work they did to accommodate him, completely bypassing the enslaver.
That is just, that is a quiet, suffocating moral pressure.
It was undeniably polite, yet absolutely devastating to the conscience.
And it actually worked.
It did. Decades before the American Civil War, decades before the broader abolitionist movements gained mainstream political traction, Woolman and others successfully convinced the entire Society of Friends to voluntarily outlaw slavery within their ranks.
Voluntarily?
Yes. Any Quaker who refused to free their enslaved people was disowned by the community. They purified their own house first, and then they became the logistical and financial backbone of the Underground Railroad and the broader abolitionist movement.
It's incredible proof of concept that alignment and integrity can move mountains. But I want to pivot to the peace aspect of the SPICES acronym, the famous Quaker peace testimony.
The peace testimony, yes.
The absolute, uncompromising rejection of all war, military service, and physical violence. This is rooted in their interpretation of Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek.
Right. And the peace testimony was actually formalized way back in 1660 in a declaration to King Charles II. They stated that they would utterly deny all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons for any end or under any pretense whatsoever.
Okay, I have to step in here and challenge this.
Go for it.
Because if you are a practical, historically aware listener, this sounds dangerously naive. It is very, very easy to be a pacifist in peacetime. It's easy to hold the moral high ground when nobody is actively invading your home.
Of course.
But what happens when you are staring down the barrel of genuine existential evil? I'm thinking about the 20th century. I'm thinking about the rise of fascism, Hitler, and the world wars. How can any sane person justify absolute pacifism while millions of innocent people are being industrialized and slaughtered?
It's the ultimate test.
Right. You can't just sit in a silent meeting house while the world burns. Doesn't the peace testimony just become cowardice in the face of something like the Holocaust?
It is the most difficult, searing question any pacifist has to face, and I promise you, the Quakers agonized over it deeply. But their response to the world wars proves that their pacifism is not passive. It is not cowardice. It is an active, incredibly dangerous form of engagement.
What did they do?
During World War I and World War II, many Quakers were drafted. Their conscience obviously forbade them from picking up a rifle to kill another human being, so they declared themselves conscientious objectors. But they didn't just stay home and hide.
Right. They didn't just opt out of the suffering and let everyone else do the dirty work.
Exactly. They volunteered for some of the most dangerous, traumatizing, non-combat roles available. Quakers formed ambulance units, like the Friends Ambulance Unit, and they drove directly into active war zones.
Into the war zones.
Under heavy artillery fire, without any weapons to defend themselves, specifically to retrieve the wounded from both sides of the conflict. They ran into the absolute meat grinder of the Western Front, armed with nothing but bandages and their convictions.
That is genuinely astonishing. And beyond the battlefield, they engaged in massive logistical humanitarian relief. Your notes specifically mentioned the American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC, which was founded during World War I.
Yes, the AFSC. Their work during and immediately after the wars was staggering.
Give me an example.
One of the most profound examples of letting your life speak occurred right after World War I. Germany was devastated, heavily blockaded, and millions of children were literally starving to death.
Just a humanitarian catastrophe.
And the Allied nations, who were still furious and grieving from the war, had very little sympathy for their defeated enemy. But the Quakers looked at the starving German children, and they saw the inner light.
They didn't see enemies.
No. So they organized a massive relief effort, known in Germany as the Quaker Speisung, which translates to the Quaker feeding. At its peak, they were providing a daily life-saving meal to over 1 million German children.
Over 1 million kids.
Yes, they fed the children of the people who had just been shooting at them.
Wow. That is the peace testimony in action right there. It's not just, I won't hurt you. It's, I will actively risk my life and my resources to heal you, even if my own government hates you.
Precisely. And that relentless, objective humanitarian work, which they continued operating across enemy lines during World War II as well, is exactly why the AFSC and the British Friends Service Council were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947.
They absolutely earned it.
They proved that there is a different, incredibly brave kind of engagement with human conflict. They approach massive, violent global conflict with the exact same methodical, patient, nonviolent approach that they use for their own internal disputes.
Which brings us to the mechanics of how this community actually governs itself without tearing itself apart.
Yes, let's look at this.
Because it is one of their most fascinating structural quirks. We've established that Quakers are a group of highly independent thinkers. They completely refuse to follow a single leader. They rely on their own internal, unmediated connection to divine truth.
Right.
So what happens when they have to make a practical decision? What happens when two Quakers completely disagree on, say, how to spend the meeting's money, or whether to build a new roof, or what specific social justice cause to support? How do they avoid absolute organizational paralysis?
They use a process called seeking unity, or finding the sense of the meeting. And to understand how radical this is, we really have to contrast it with the way the rest of the modern world operates.
Right.
The bedrock of modern democracy and corporate governance is majority rule voting. Robert's Rules of Order. We debate, we take a vote, and if 51% of the room agrees, the motion passes.
But if you're the Liza persona we discussed earlier, someone who hates arbitrary rules, majority rule voting is deeply flawed, because it means that 51% of the room has the power to force the other 49% to do something they might actively hate.
Exactly. Voting inherently creates a winner and a loser. It encourages factionalism, lobbying, backroom deals, and power plays. It's fundamentally competitive.
So what's the alternative?
The Quaker system of consensus completely discards majority rule. They do not vote, ever.
I never vote.
Never. The core assumption of consensus is that if the inner light is real, and if every single person in the room is earnestly listening to it, the community should eventually be guided to a single, unified truth.
Okay, so who runs the meeting?
The process is facilitated by a clerk, who is not a president or a boss, but more of a servant listener.
So how does it actually work in the room? Walk me through a business meeting.
The community sits in silence, very much like a worship meeting. The issue is introduced. Members speak, out of the silence, sharing their perspective. The clerk listens intensely, not just to the loudest voices, but to the underlying themes, the hesitations, the silent body language of the entire room.
Sounds exhausting for the clerk.
It is. Periodically, the clerk will try to articulate the sense of the meeting. They will say something like, "It seems the meeting is leaning toward this decision."
And if everyone agrees, they record the decision and they move on. But what if someone disagrees? What if one stubborn person thinks the decision is completely wrong?
That is where yes, they must return to silence, return to discussion, and continue seeking a third way that honors the truth in everyone's perspective.
Okay, looking at this from a modern corporate perspective, this sounds like a logistical nightmare.
I know, it sounds terrible.
In our modern world, we worship efficiency. We want instant decisions. We want to take a quick call on Slack and just move on with our day. Spending hours, maybe even weeks or months of consecutive meetings trying to get an entire room of independent, stubborn thinkers to reach total unity sounds exhausting. It sounds like a recipe for getting absolutely nothing done.
It is deeply exhausting. Any Quaker who has served on a difficult business committee will readily tell you that the process can be agonizingly slow and frustrating. But the Quaker counter-argument is really profound. Efficiency is not the primary goal. Alignment is.
Alignment over efficiency?
Exactly. If you force a 51% vote, you get a fast decision, yes. But you might spend the next 5 years dealing with the toxic resentment, the sabotage, and the fractured relationships of the losing faction.
You win the battle, but destroy the community.
Precisely. If you take the agonizing time to reach true, deep consensus, once that decision is finally made, the entire community is unified behind it. All the friction has been dealt with up front. The implementation is seamless because everyone owns the decision.
It builds an incredibly resilient community.
It does. It is a slow, deliberate process, and it is the primary reason this completely decentralized tradition has survived for nearly 400 years without splintering into a million tiny pieces.
Well, mostly without splintering, because we do need to look at the historical reality that they haven't always reached perfect unity.
No, they haven't.
Over the centuries, particularly in the 19th century, the tradition did experience some really painful schisms. They had to adapt to theological shifts and a modernizing world, which is the perfect entry point into the final major area of your notes, the modern reality of global Quakerism.
Yes, this is a crucial section, because we need to completely update the mental model of anyone listening who still pictures Quakers as people in 17th century bonnets churning butter in Pennsylvania, or, confuses them with the Amish.
Right, they are not the Amish.
Not at all. They are not historical artifacts. They are a vibrant, evolving, highly complex global community today.
Your notes point out that the internal diversity of modern Quakerism is staggering. The movement has essentially branched into 3 major expressions, and if you walk into one of them, it might be completely unrecognizable from the others.
Yes, let's break these down. First, we have what are called the Liberal Friends.
The Liberal Friends.
The Liberal branch is what you will most commonly find in the UK, the northeastern United States, and the West Coast. These are the meetings that have maintained the traditional, unprogrammed, silent worship.
So no pastors, no planned music.
Right. But theologically, they have become incredibly broad and progressive. They do not insist on strict Christian dogma. In fact, many liberal meetings are non-creedal to the point where they warmly welcome people of multiple faiths.
So if you walk into a liberal meeting house in London or Philadelphia today, you might sit in silence next to someone who considers themselves a progressive Christian, someone who practices Buddhist meditation, a humanist, and an atheist, all just valuing the shared contemplative space and the ethical framework.
Exactly. They're united by the practice, not the creed. And the liberal branch is heavily, heavily focused on the social action aspect of the tradition: climate justice, LGBTQ equality, prison abolition, and refugee support.
And while they are perhaps the most famous representation of Quakerism in Western media, they are actually a minority globally, right?
They are. Which brings us to the evangelical friends. And this is where the global geography of the movement just blows my mind.
Yeah, this part of the notes was wild.
The largest populations of Quakers in the world today are not in England or Pennsylvania. They are in Africa, specifically Kenya, and in parts of Latin America like Bolivia and Guatemala.
And the evangelical branch looks entirely different from the liberal branch.
Entirely different. They have programmed worship services. They have actual paid pastors who deliver prepared sermons. They have choirs, modern worship music, and a theology that is deeply rooted in orthodox biblical Christianity, often aligning with mainstream evangelicalism, but retaining a focus on the peace testimony and social equality.
How does that even happen? How does a deeply silent, radically anti-clergy movement from 17th century England end up as a massive evangelical church with pastors and drum sets in Nairobi, Kenya?
It is a fascinating story of 19th and 20th century missionary adaptation. In the late 1800s, there was a major revival movement within American Quakerism. Many Quakers felt the silent meetings had become stagnant and overly quietistic.
Like they were just fading away.
Yeah. So they adopted revival techniques, they hired pastors to retain the youth, and they drafted the Richmond Declaration of Faith in 1887 to clarify their Orthodox Christian belief.
And then they went global.
Exactly. They sent missionaries around the world. When these missionaries went to East Africa, the vibrant, pastoral, explicitly biblical form of Christianity they brought resonated deeply with local cultural and spiritual expressions. The movement absolutely exploded in Kenya, adapting to the local context while keeping the Quaker name and the core peace values.
So you have this massive global divergence. On one hand, silent atheists in London, and on the other, charismatic evangelicals in Kenya. And then sitting somewhere in the middle, you have the conservative friends.
Yes, conservative friends are a much smaller, quieter branch. And the word conservative here doesn't mean modern political conservatism. It means they are trying to conserve the original practices of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Right, conserving the tradition.
They hold unprogrammed, silent meetings exactly like the liberals, but they maintain a distinctly, explicitly Christian theology like the evangelicals. They're kind of the bridge holding the historical tension of the movement together.
It's an incredible synthesis. You have a movement born in the grim, bloody chaos of the English Civil War that morphs into a massive evangelical presence in East Africa, while simultaneously becoming a huge hub for post-institutional progressive social justice seekers in the Western world.
And it continues to grow in the West, precisely because it resonates so strongly with what modern people are desperately looking for right now.
Yeah, think about the cultural zeitgeist. People are deeply skeptical of massive religious and political institutions. They are exhausted by top-down leadership.
Absolutely exhausted.
They are craving mindfulness, egalitarian community, participatory decision-making, and environmental stewardship. And Quakerism offers an infrastructure for literally all of that, but with a battle-tested 350-year track record.
It is the ultimate post-institutional tradition. It provides a home for people who value personal authenticity and rigorous ethics over forced dogma.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. It brings us back to Liz, the independent thinker, the person who challenges norms.
Yes, the Liz profile.
If you are listening to this and you are inherently skeptical of hierarchy, if you really bristle at being told what to believe by an authority figure, but you still deeply crave an ethical grounding and a supportive community, this tradition feels like it was custom-built for your psychology.
Is the absolute realization of a contemplative ethical tradition. It proves that you can dismantle the hierarchy, trust the internal compass, and still build a coherent, world-changing community.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's look at the big takeaway here, really synthesizing all these dense historical notes you provided. We have journeyed from 1640s England, where farmers were literally rotting in dungeons because they wouldn't take off their hats,
Right.
to John Woolman quietly dismantling the slave trade in American parlors, to the harrowing ambulance runs of World War I, all the way to massive evangelical worship services in modern-day Kenya.
And the defining thread connecting all of these disparate eras and practices, the absolute core engine of this deep dive, is a fundamental shift in the questions we ask about faith and life.
What's the shift?
Traditional institutions ask, what must we believe? What rules must we obey to be in good standing? The Quakers discarded that entirely. They replaced it with a much more demanding, much more terrifying question. How should we live if the Spirit truly guides us directly?
Exactly. Morality isn't about signing a piece of paper, it's about whether your life reflects the light. And for you, the listener, the true value of studying this specific tradition isn't necessarily about adopting a new religion.
No, not at all.
It is about examining a historical proof of concept. The early Quakers proved that living with unyielding, radical, inconvenient integrity is a genuinely powerful alternative to just coasting along with institutional rules. They proved that a small group of highly aligned, deeply contemplative people can literally change the trajectory of human history.
It is a profound legacy of moral courage.
It really is.
Yeah.
And looking at all of this, it leaves me with one final thought, something for you to chew on as we wrap up today's analysis. We live in an era of unprecedented, deafening information overload. Our daily lives are absolutely flooded with noise.
So much noise.
Algorithms, social media influencers, cable news pundits, thought leaders, they're constantly beamed directly into our pockets. They're constantly telling us what to think, what to buy, who to vote for, and who we should be angry at today. In many ways, these digital systems act as the new clergy of the modern age. They are the new, unappointed gatekeepers of truth and outrage.
They are the new architects of the social hierarchy, and they demand our continuous, unthinking participation.
So here is the question. If a group of radical shoemakers and farmers in the 1600s could find the immense courage to silence the overwhelming, legally enforced noise of their own era's religious dogma, if they could sit in an empty room, quiet their minds, and actually hear their own inner light, what would a modern meeting for worship look like for you?
That is the real question.
How do you, as an independent thinker, strip away the relentless digital noise? How do you bypass the modern algorithms and the new clergy to find that quiet, unmediated, authentic truth in your own life today?
That is the daily work of true independence. Finding the silence is the first step to finding the truth.
It is an ongoing challenge for all of us. Thank you so much for bringing such incredibly rich, thought-provoking notes to the table today. This has been a phenomenal journey through history, psychology, and ethics, and we absolutely cannot wait to dive into whatever research you send us next.